The Keth Dominion had, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the most entertaining thing they could do with a Tuesday afternoon was watch a human die. Now, before you judge them too harshly, understand that the Keth had been the apex predators of this galaxy for roughly 400,000 years. They had watched civilizations rise, stumble, and collapse like drunk students at a graduation ceremony. They had seen telepathic species burn themselves out trying to outthink each other. They had watched the Vorhai, the most physically imposing species ever catalogued, go extinct because they were too proud to eat anything that hadn't personally insulted them. The Keth had seen everything. They were, by every measurable standard, bored out of their 12-segmented minds. So when a human vessel, a battered cargo hauler registered under the name Perseverant Mule, drifted into Keth-controlled space broadcasting a very confused distress signal, the Dominion's Entertainment Committee, yes, they had one of those, convened within the hour. The signal was a masterpiece of human communication. It was simultaneously a request for help, an apology for the inconvenience, a complaint about the ship's cooling system, and what appeared to be a half-finished grocery list. Councillor Drevon, who chaired the Entertainment Committee and had the aesthetic sensibilities of a particularly dramatic thunderstorm, declared it the most promising raw material he had encountered in decades. The crew of 3 was brought aboard the Keth flagship, the Sovereign Permanence, a vessel the size of a small moon that had been specifically designed to make visitors feel like ants at a picnic. The human crew consisted of one Yusra Okonkwo, listed as captain despite her insistence that she was, quote, just the one who happened to be awake when things went wrong, one Tibor Ferenczi, the ship's engineer, who arrived aboard the Sovereign Permanence carrying a wrench he refused to put down, and one Priya Nambiar, a cargo specialist who, upon seeing the interior of the Keth flagship for the first time, pulled out a small notebook and began sketching. The Keth found this last detail deeply suspicious. Now, the Dominion's little entertainment scheme worked like this. They would place the humans in the Gauntlet, a constructed obstacle environment that had been specifically designed over centuries to be lethal to every species who had ever entered it. 47 species. 47. Not one had made it past the 3rd section. The Vorhai, those same proud giants who had starved themselves into extinction, had lasted longest, reaching the 4th section before a pressure-triggered floor panel had ended their run in a manner that Keth historians still described with barely concealed delight. The Gauntlet was the Dominion's crown jewel of cruelty, and they were very proud of it, the way a certain type of person is proud of a particularly vicious garden, all sharp edges and no shade. Draven delivered the terms himself, standing in the observation room above the holding cells, his 4 eyes cycling through colors that indicated professional satisfaction. The humans would enter the Gauntlet if they survived, which he said with the tone of a being who had never seriously considered the possibility. They would be released with full passage rights through Keth space. If they did not survive, the Keth would catalog the manner of their failure and add it to the archive, which was the closest thing the Dominion had to a hobby collection. Yusra listened to all of this with the expression of someone who has just been told the restaurant is out of what they ordered and is internally deciding whether to make a scene. She asked 3 questions. First, were the terms binding under Dominion law? Drevon confirmed they were, slightly surprised she knew enough about Dominion law to ask. Second, could Tibor bring the wrench? A pause. A brief internal debate among the Keth observers. Yes, fine. The wrench was permitted. It would not help. Third, and this was the one that made Drevon's color cycle briefly stutter. Had any of the 47 species been permitted to study the Gauntlet's layout before entering? No, he said. That was rather the point. Yusra nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not actually agreeing with you but have decided the conversation is over. She turned to Tibor and Priya, and the 3 of them had a conversation in low voices that the Keth translation matrix rendered as approximately. Logistics, concern about the 3rd section, something about load-bearing tolerances, and a brief argument about whether the notebook was waterproof. The notebook, it turned out, was going to be important. The Gauntlet's 1st section was, by Keth standards, a warm-up. temperature extremes cycling between near-vacuum cold and furnace heat, timed at intervals designed to catch a species mid-adaptation. The Vorhai had burned through their thermal regulation trying to keep up with the cycles. The Tolhari, a methane-breathing species who had entered with enormous confidence, had lasted approximately 4 minutes before the oxygen-rich atmosphere in Section 2 had become a personal problem. The Keth observers settled into their viewing platforms with refreshments and the comfortable anticipation of professionals watching amateurs attempt something technical. What they were not expecting was for Yusra to walk directly to the first thermal vent, crouch down and start timing it with the watch on her wrist. She spent 11 minutes in the entry corridor doing nothing but watching. Not panicking. Not running, not making the high-pitched distress sounds that the Keth had come to associate with species realizing what they had agreed to, just watching, and occasionally murmuring numbers to Priya, who wrote them in the notebook. In the observation deck, Dravan asked his assistant, Veketh, what the human was doing. Veketh studied the feed. She appears to be identifying the cycle intervals, he said. Dravan considered this. Then what? He asked. Veketh had no answer for that. None of the 47 had gotten far enough to require a then what. The thermal section fell in just under 19 minutes. Not because the humans had any special resistance to temperature, they clearly did not. Tibor's commentary during the cold phase was both creative and continuous. They moved through it in the gaps, timing their advances to the half-second, using the walls for insulation during the heat pulses, and moving fast through the cold ones because, as Priya noted in the notebook, the cold cycles were 3 seconds shorter than the heat cycles, an asymmetry that had apparently never mattered before because no one had ever been standing still long enough to notice it. They entered Section 2 damp, cold, slightly singed at the edges, and completely intact. The Keth observation deck had gone very quiet. Section 2 was the pressure maze, which was perhaps the Dominion's most elegant piece of design work, if you had a definition of elegant, that included the phrase, catastrophic structural failure. The floor was a grid of panels, each connected to a pressure system that responded to weight distribution. Step on the wrong sequence, and sections of the maze would shift, redirect, or in the case of panels marked in a frequency only visible to species with ultraviolet sight, simply drop. The Tolhari had not made it 10 steps in. The Vorhai had made it to the 4th row before discovering, memorably, that their confidence in their own map of the first 3 rows had been misplaced. Tibor looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he looked at his wrench. Then he looked at the floor again, with the expression of a man who has just had an idea that he knows is going to work, but is also going to be extremely annoying to execute. He started tapping panels. Not stepping on them. Tapping. Using the wrench handle, crouching at the edge of each row and knocking against the surface, listening to the resonance with his ear practically against the floor. The Keth had not included acoustic variation in the panel design because it had not occurred to them that anyone would be listening. Why would you listen to a floor? What kind of species listened to floors? Humans, apparently. Priya mapped it. Every tap, every tone difference, building a grid in the notebook that took shape like a solved puzzle working backwards from the solution. It took 43 minutes. The Keth observers did not refresh their drinks. They did not speak. Dravan sat with 4 eyes fully open, which in Keth physiology indicated either intense concentration or complete shock. And in this moment, it was both. The 3 humans walked the pressure maze without triggering a single panel shift. When they emerged from Section 2 into the corridor before the 3rd, Yusra sat down against the wall and Tibor sat next to her. And Priya kept writing in the notebook, and all 3 of them breathed for a while. Not celebrating, not congratulating themselves, just breathing in the way of people who know they are not done and are treating their lungs with the appropriate respect. In the observation deck, Veketh finally spoke. "Counselor," he said quietly, "no species has reached the 3rd section." "I am aware," said Dravan. "The 3rd section," Veketh continued, "was designed for a species that reached it." Another pause. "Was it?" said Dravan, in the tone of someone asking a question they already regret. There was a longer silence. "The 3rd section's fail-safes," Veketh said carefully, "assume a species that is panicking. The escalation triggers are calibrated to fear responses: elevated heart rate, erratic movement, increased thermal output from stress. If the subject is not panicking, Draven turned very slowly to look at his assistant. If the subject is not panicking, Vekath finished, the escalation doesn't trigger. And the base configuration of the third section is a pause that felt significantly longer than it was. Survivable, Vekath said, in the smallest voice his species was physically capable of producing. Down in the corridor, Yusra Okonkwo stood up, brushed dust off her knees, looked at Priya's notebook, and said something that the translation matrix rendered after a brief hesitation as, "All right, one more. And then we have a very specific conversation with the people running this place." Tibor picked up his wrench. Priya closed the notebook and put it in her pocket. They walked toward Section 3. The third section of the Gauntlet was, in the words of its original designer, a psychological crescendo. That designer, a Keth engineer named Osivar, had spent 16 years building something that he described in his technical notes as the point at which hope becomes its own weapon against the subject. He had been very proud of this. He had attended every single run of the Gauntlet in his lifetime, sitting in the observation deck with a personal recording device, cataloging the exact moment each species broke. Osivar had died 11 years ago, peacefully, in his sleep, having never once seen his crescendo function as intended, because no one had ever reached it. His personal notes, retrieved from the archive for this occasion, turned out to contain a line that Vekath read aloud to Draven in a voice that suggested he would rather be doing literally anything else. The line read, "If a species somehow reaches Section 3 without fear escalation, the sensory environment is calibrated too low to be lethal. Increase base settings before any future run involving a non-standard subject." No one had ever increased the base settings. There had never been a reason to. Draven stared at his assistant for a long time. Vekath stared back. Outside the observation window, the humans walked into Section 3. Now, Section 3 in its base configuration was, admittedly, still not a pleasant place. It was a large dark space filled with shifting obstacles, randomized air pressure bursts, and an electromagnetic field that interfered with anything electronic, which was meant to strip away any technological advantages a spacefaring species might bring in. The Keth had been very thorough about the electromagnetic component. What they had failed to account for, in their thoroughness, was that one of their 3 current subjects had already surrendered her electronic watch in the first section because the thermal cycling was affecting its accuracy, that the second had a wrench, and that the third had a paper notebook and a pencil. Paper. A pencil. Technology so old that the Keth's electromagnetic countermeasures had been designed approximately 300,000 years after anyone relevant had stopped using it. Priya Nambiar walked through the electromagnetic field, opened her notebook to a fresh page, and began sketching the obstacle layout by feel and memory in the dark. Tibor, who had spent 20 years as an engineer on vessels that broke down in places with no power and no light, moved through the shifting obstacles with the calm patience of a man who had learned that darkness was not an enemy, it was just an inconvenient setting. Yusra, for her part, had spent the first section memorizing the Gauntlet's rhythm, the second section understanding its logic, and was now in the third section doing something that Draven watched with increasing unease and could not immediately name. She was talking, not to anyone in particular, not to her crew specifically, though they responded when she addressed them. She was narrating, in a low, continuous murmur, what she was observing, what she was inferring, what she expected to find 3 steps ahead based on what she had found 3 steps behind. She was building a model of the space out loud, in real time, updating it as new information arrived, and her crew was listening and correcting and adding their own observations, the 3 of them constructing between them a living map of a space designed to be unmappable. It was, Vekath said softly, like watching a species that had evolved specifically for this. They had not evolved for this, Draven said, because he felt one of them should say something rational. No, Vekath agreed. They evolved for something harder. The question of what humanity had evolved for was one that the Keth xenobiologists had been arguing about since first contact. largely because the answer kept changing, depending on which era of human history you examined. Early humans, persistence hunters, chasing prey across open ground for hours until the prey simply gave up and died of exhaustion. The Keth equivalent of this strategy was considered in Dominion philosophy to be an act of psychological warfare. Humans had apparently invented it to have lunch. Later humans, agricultural, then industrial, then digital, each transition faster than the last, each one requiring the previous generation to either adapt or be left behind by their own children. The Keth had managed 3 significant technological transitions in 400,000 years and considered themselves excellent at change. Humans had managed 11 in 400. The Keth xenobiologists had eventually settled on a working hypothesis that humanity's primary evolutionary advantage was the complete inability to recognize when something was supposed to be impossible. Watching Yusra calmly narrate her way through a lethal obstacle course in the dark, while her engineer listened to floors and her cargo specialist drew maps by feel, Draven was beginning to think the xenobiologists had undersold it. Section 3 fell in 31 minutes. The humans came out the other side into a short corridor that ended in a sealed door, and they stood in front of it for a moment. All 3 of them, not speaking. Then Tibor said something that the translation matrix rendered as a very specific type of tired, the kind that is not defeated, just finished with a particular task and aware that a different task is beginning. Priya closed her notebook. Yusra looked at the door, and then up at the observation window above the corridor, and then directly, with considerable precision, at the camera mounted in the upper corner. She knew where the camera was because she had been tracking camera positions since Section 1. Vikath confirmed this when Draven asked, producing a timestamp log that showed Yusra's sightlines had intersected with every observation point in the Gauntlet at least twice. She had been watching them watch her. For the first time in 400,000 years of galactic dominance, Counselor Draven felt something that his species' emotional vocabulary did not have a precise word for. The closest translation available was the sensation of standing at the edge of something and being uncertain, for the first time, whether you are the one looking down. He opened the communication channel to the corridor. The terms were met, he said. The door will open. You are free to leave. Yusra did not look away from the camera. I know, she said. I want to have that conversation now. The conversation, as it turned out, lasted 4 hours. It was not a conversation that Draven had been prepared for, because the conversations that followed a Gauntlet run, in the 47 times there had been conversations, had always followed a predictable shape. Grief, usually, demands for explanation, sometimes anger, though the Keth's physical and technological superiority tended to make anger brief. The Vorhai, in their final communications before their species' end, had sent a message that was essentially an extended howl of wounded pride. The Dominion had archived it under As Expected. Yusra Okonkwo sat down across from Draven in the meeting room he had somewhat hastily arranged, with Tibor on her left still holding the wrench and Priya on her right with the notebook open to a fresh page, and she said, very calmly, that she had 3 things to tell him. First, the Gauntlet had 7 structural vulnerabilities that could be triggered from inside by someone with sufficient time and a basic understanding of load-bearing tolerances. She knew this because Tibor had identified them. She produced, from Priya's notebook, a page of annotated sketches. Draven looked at the sketches. He passed them to Vekath. Vekath looked at them for a long time and then nodded, once, with the expression of someone confirming a diagnosis they had hoped was wrong. Second, the observation systems had 17 blind spots, which she knew because she had mapped them from the inside while appearing to navigate by instinct. She had, in Section 2, spent 4 of the 43 minutes specifically not solving the pressure maze because she was using the time to locate camera positions without appearing to look for them. She was telling him this, she said, not as a threat, but as a demonstration. A demonstration of what, Draven asked. Of the difference, she said, between a species that built this place and a species that walked through it. Draven was quiet for a moment. The third thing, he said, Because there was a third thing, and he found he wanted to know all of it now. The way you press on a bruise, not because it is pleasant, but because you need to understand the full extent of the damage. The third thing, Yusra said, was a proposal. She wanted passage rights. Not just for the perseverant mule, for human vessels operating in a trade corridor that ran through the outer boundary of Keth space, a corridor that the Dominion currently taxed at a rate that Yusra described as, and the translation matrix reproduced this faithfully, absolutely heroic in its audacity. In exchange, she said, they would not tell anyone what had happened here. Dryvon looked at her. She looked back with the expression of someone holding a wrench, metaphorically speaking, and having already decided where it was going. The Keth Dominion's reputation, Dryvon understood, was not a small thing. 400,000 years of apex status rested on a foundation of carefully maintained inevitability. Every species in the galaxy knew that the Gauntlet was unsurvivable, not because the Keth had lied. They hadn't needed to. It had simply been true. If the story of 3 humans with a wrench and a paper notebook walking out of it alive reached the broader galactic community, the architecture of that reputation would develop, as Tybor might put it, certain structural vulnerabilities. The trade corridor access was, in the grand context of Keth holdings, a minor thing, a rounding error, a concession so small that agreeing to it cost nothing measurable. Dryvon agreed. The paperwork was completed within the hour. Yusra signed it with a pen that Priya produced from the same pocket as the notebook. Dryvon used the Dominion's formal seal. Tybor witnessed it, still holding the wrench, which Dryvon had stopped mentioning because it was clearly never going away. The humans were escorted back to the perseverant mule, which the Keth engineering team had, in a gesture Dryvon had ordered without entirely understanding why, repaired. The cooling system, specifically. It had seemed like the right thing to do. As the cargo hauler cleared the Sovereign Permanence's docking range and accelerated toward the trade corridor, Dryvon stood at the observation window and watched it go. Veketh stood beside him. Should we upgrade the Gauntlet? Veketh asked. Dryvon thought about this for a while. What would we upgrade it to? He asked. Veketh did not have an answer. The thing about building a trap specifically designed to stop anything you have ever encountered, Dryvon thought, is that it works perfectly right up until the moment something walks through it that you have never encountered. And the truly uncomfortable part, the part that was going to take him a long time to fully process, was that the humans had not done anything miraculous. They had not had special powers or superior technology or physical advantages that defied biological explanation. They had timed vents, tapped floors, mapped cameras, and taken notes in a paper notebook. They had done what they always apparently did, which was look at a thing that was supposed to be impossible and simply begin the process of making it possible, one small, careful step at a time, without drama, without ceremony, with only the quiet and slightly irritating confidence of a species that had been doing exactly this for so long that they had stopped noticing it was remarkable. The perseverant mule disappeared into the dark between stars. In the meeting room, someone from the administrative staff found Priya's pencil, which she had left behind, almost certainly accidentally. It was a small yellow pencil, well used, with a worn eraser at one end. It was the least impressive object that had ever been inside the Sovereign Permanence. Dryvon had it placed in the archive, not under entertainment, not under subjects or incidents or records of the Gauntlet's operation. He filed it under warning. And then he sat down at his desk and began, for the first time in his career, to think very carefully about what it meant that humanity was out there, in the dark, with their notebooks and their wrenches and their complete constitutional inability to accept that something was finished just because it was supposed to be. He thought about it for a long time. He did not find the thinking comfortable. Good. He rather suspected that was the point.